Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to this week's edition of Imperial as One's Belonging series, where we explore the experiences of individuals from Black, Asian, and minority backgrounds. And this week we've got a real pleasure. I say this every week, but every week I'm proved to be correct. We've got Professor Mustafa Ozbilgin, and he is a professor of organizational behavior at Brunel University. Mustafa, I want to just say a big thank you for agreeing to be a guest with us today. And I'm going to kick us off with the question which I ask every week, which is, can you give us a little bit of how you developed your sense of belonging, your sense of identity growing up? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you very much, Wayne. It's lovely to be part of this talk series. Well, it's a very good question, how I developed my sense of belonging. One of my very first papers was on belonging.
Right.
Belonging and gender equality in financial services sector. And belonging in that paper, I argued, had two aspects. One is the key aspect, longing. You have a longing for something, and being part, belonging. And it's very easy to define the belonging part. I'm an academic working on equality, diversity, and inclusion issues. I'm from Turkey. I was born on the third quarter of the last century in 1970. So I'm quite old. I'm 51 years old, heading towards 52. So I live in Britain in the last 26 years. I work on equality, diversity, and inclusion topics in the workplace. So this is the sense of belonging I have academically. But in terms of what I long for, if I have to describe my belonging in terms of a longing, I long for a society which has a greater level of social justice across all strands of it. And we need to improve our sensitivity towards demands of social groups and deliver that. And I have also a longing for moving the debate on equality and inclusion towards institutional change, moving it from institutions navel gazing and declaring their support to changing their institutions. This is where I stand at the moment.
Right. I love that. I'm going to pull you back a little bit because there was a couple of things which you said, which was about longing, belonging having two components, longing and belonging, okay, and what you long for. And one of the things which I wanted to gain a sense of is where in your upbringing did you get this desire to understand about how people belong and their sense of who they are within the organization?
Sure. As I said, I was brought up in Turkey. I completed my undergraduate degree and master's degree in Turkey. And during my master's degree, I completed dissertation, and also my finishing piece of work in my undergraduate study was on culture. When I looked at financial services sector and culture, I realized that there are two cultures for men and women in the sector in Turkey. And I wanted to pursue a study to look at how culture is gendered. Because in the Turkish case, it was a very interesting time. It was 1994, and there were proportionately more women in finance in higher positions than in Turkey than in Britain, because Turkey is not a country of equality. If you look at all the indices of gender equality, Turkey lags behind its European counterparts. But in terms of women in positions of power, Turkey had a numerically higher number, proportionately higher number of women in professions like engineering, finance, in really elite professions like also university professors. Turkey had the highest proportion of female professors. So it presented a very curious picture. I wanted to find out why. And I have a good sense of, I've always had a good sense of social justice.
Right.
And I thought, this is a curious case. Why is Turkey doing better in terms of women in positions of power? So that's how my journey started. I completed my PhD on that. And since then, I have been looking at ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, and other factors that divide societies on structure fault lines.
So you said that you noticed about this, and I'm going to say anomaly or something which didn't seem to be, people may not think, oh, that's quite logical because it was Turkey, and that you'd expect on the indices that you'd expect the UK and them to be probably more advanced, etc. So what was it that you found was the main reason why there was this discrepancy? Why was it that in Turkey there were more women in positions of authority, positions of leadership than there were here in the UK? Was there anything that stood out to you?
Yes, I think the role of history was very significant, because once the Ottoman Empire collapsed and Turkish Republic was established, Turkish financial sector was nationalized and it started afresh. However, British financial services sector has history stretching over 300 years without a major reformation in terms of gender equality regimes. So gender equality is an ideology. So organizations which start afresh sometimes capture the moral landscape much better. And so did the financial services sector in 1920s, because there was a big push for gender equality at that time. Turkish women were gaining their rights for voting. And so they started at the same level with men. But in 1920s in Britain, although gender equality debate was going ahead, there was a strong feminist movement. That movement really pushed women to enter into occupations rather than to push their position in positions of power. For example, in financial services sector, there has never been a major shift of power in terms of gender at the top.
So that the pivotal moment in time then was the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the women's right for the women's desire for equality, and that there was that space which was made available. I'm not going to say to exploit, but to develop. And so that's what happened within the Turkish setting. Is that what? That's
right. I mean, if you look at the comparison between financial services sector and high technology sector in the UK, see this as well. Women were able to enter, women, men, and also people from different socio-demographic backgrounds were able to enter as equals to the high-tech sector. So the sector were able to recruit much greater diversity than financial service sector does today. There's a huge competition in terms of recruiting people with analytical skills. And I ask my students, for example, where they would like to head to. They all say high-tech sector instead of finance, because finance, they know they have to change themselves. The institution will not change. When I was talking to a CEO of a finance organization, they were saying, oh, we are also becoming flexible. You can loosen your tie on Fridays. So this is the extent to which they understand the institutional change. You know, there's an issue of authenticity. Young people would like to work in organizations which offer them some chance of being who they are. And many organizations continue it. How they were set up to continue. So they don't change their regulation of clothes. They don't change regulation of time. There is still huge face time in the UK, which prevents women with domestic responsibilities to caring responsibilities also to go up in management levels, even if they perform the same as men.
Just recap on that notion of the FaceTime. What do you mean in terms of the FaceTime?
Well, my statistics may be slightly dated, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Britain was appearing to be a country where people worked longest hours, but with the lowest productivity in Europe. So we value being at work more than doing the work.
Yeah.
So I think also our systems of recruitment, promotion, really value one's temporal commitment to work rather than their output. And that presents a lot of disadvantages for women and also people from different minority ethnic groups where, for example, caring for family, caring for elderly, it also can affect, for example, single fathers more adversely. Even if they do the work, equal work, their value would be less because they don't appear to be at work, or they may not appear committed. So we need to divide temporal commitment with commitment in terms of performance.
So so it's not about how long you're in the workplace, it's how productive you are whilst you're in the workplace is more beneficial and a better indicator.
Absolutely. And also workplaces which allow you greater scope for authenticity will survive in the future. You know, authenticity at the moment is the domain of the privileged. If you are rich and super privileged, you can be yourself. But otherwise, if you are women, if you are minority, Black and minority ethnic, if you are lesbian, gay, bisexual, if you have a disability, you have to leave your authenticity at the door of the organization and fit with their, heteronormative structures, sexist cultures, and racist undertones. Your authenticity is tarnished. So I think you lose a lot of energy in trying to fit with the organization. So organizations which allow for you to be yourself, and time example was just a tiny example. Use of time, but use of place, for example, how the office space is used will have consequences for these different categories of diversity. Similarly, how workplace practices are designed. Certain processes can have systemic bias ingrained in it across all categories. So we need to really bias-proof our organizations, not really focus on our individual behaviors alone, because most of the equality diversity debate is centered around unconscious bias and individual forms of behavior. Behavior is only an aspect of equality. What really needs to change is the organizational design.
Can we expand on that organizational design element then? Because you're saying that behaviors is only a small proportion of what's actually necessary for change to take place. You're saying we need much more organizational, much more systematic change in order for us to see a true cultural change or a true organizational behavior change. Is that right?
Absolutely. For example, we have just finished a paper, Neocolonial Structures in Academia, how people from colonized territories, when they work in Britain, are considered as second-class academics, and their theorization is neglected, and they are used as brokers of data. They bring data. It's instead of extraction of resources, natural resources, they extract data from colonized territories through these academics. So what needs to change there is not individual behaviors, but the structures which lead to devaluing of, for example, data or theories from abroad. So how can we do that? We need to start asking the question, what would it take you to be valued in this organization? We need to first collect data So design, good design, co-design, this idea of co-design, designing something afresh with atypical participants has two aspects. First aspect, we need to know what is wrong, what goes wrong. We know pretty much what goes wrong in organizations and how people feel excluded, marginalized, demarcated. And then the second aspect is, having collected the data, how can we address these biases to change the design? Yes, so design ideas can go into the heart of the organization from the founding principles. For example, you are at Imperial College, we talked about this before, Imperial. Each time I hear as someone coming from a republic, shudder. For example, how comfortable you would feel joining Imperial College, for example, as the outsider. You may be an innovator, great scientist, but you will be, you'll belong from the outside. Your sense of belonging will be tarnished. So changing name, for example, is simple. It sounds simple, but it's happening across Britain. For example, Cass Business School has recently changed to Bayes Business School, changed their name. But then you need to look deeper inside into their structures of power. They have minority ethnic representation in their professorship, for example. In the cohort of vice chancellors, for example, deans, heads of schools. So you need to get deeper into numbers and see what is preventing people accessing these sources of power and authority, and then change those. And one of the key issues is trust deficit. Trust deficit happens to all of us who come from atypical backgrounds, backgrounds that are underrepresented, disenfranchised, or historically discriminated against. We start with -5, and people start with 50. So we need to make up for that trust deficit. That's why people from atypical backgrounds, if they make it in hierarchies of power, they tend to be super competent. But the fact that we are super competent is a discrimination itself. So this is it's a sign of systemic discrimination that we have been subjected to through deep mechanisms of trust deficit. You cannot see trust deficit just by simply observing behavior. Even the notion of trustees. Those people who are trusted. Look at the board of trustees, how diverse they are. Why are women not equally represented? We looked at, for example, with one colleague to board of trustees in pension trust funds. And even when the number of women increased, still how they are trusted didn't change. They were still relegated to second-class status, and they were expected to provide care to men in the boardroom, which has nothing to do with what they are qualified for. So trust is a very deep social construct. We need to build trust to heterodox and atypical candidates, because one really interesting thing I keep on using, if we add up all the atypical people in organizations, women in terms of power positions, BAME, LGBT, people with disability, people with atypical religious beliefs or no beliefs at all, if you add these people up, it makes up 80%. What we had as atypical in the past now constitute 80% of the talent pool. This is the problem. I mean, organizations, if they continue to recruit from the 20%, they will get the wrong people for their elite positions, leadership positions. So they need to wise up, and they can't simply look at this as a numeric issue, because without trust, even if you bring someone, for example, you bring a woman in the board, if they fail, that failure will be attributed to women.
Yeah.
But if a man fails, we never attribute that failure to manhood.
Yeah.
I mean, men fail all the time.
Yeah.
Male leaders fail all the time. We have couple, we can give example from politics to corporate life in Britain. They do fail, but we are not unkind to manhood. But gender gets beaten. And if a black man fails, then being black gets beaten.
Yep.
Yes. Yep. So I think we need to change our ideas of trust and how we are putting diversity on trial all the time.
So I really love this debate, really love it. How do we do that? Because you're always going to get that pushback. We've got a situation going on at the moment where a suggestion was made and automatically there was almost like a defensive pushback. How do we overcome that pushback that we're going to receive if we try to implement some of this change which is so desperately needed?
Yes, I mean, doing institutional changes, systemic changes take time, and also co-designing institutions, organizations with newcomers require real strong leadership and also evidence-based leadership in a way. And I'm hopeful about it because if you compare our conditions in terms of equality and diversity and inclusion, you see that we have taken steps over the last 30 years. This is a long march. Mm-hmm. This is not going to be an easy journey. So we keep on trying. And also, it's great that you raise this issue, that we should not be naive. If we stop the struggle, there will be major setbacks and backlash, because backlash is real. People in positions of power get there through two means. One is the earned privilege. Mm-hmm. So they can go to appropriate education, training, and they perform well, they get there. Or they can get there through unearned privilege, because they are born in the right family, right class, right color, right gender, and it's like an invisible lift. Takes them up there. So we need to block that other route. And it's not going to be easy because they know that Turkeys do not vote for Christmas. They know that their time is up. Incompetent, but privileged, with privileges that are afforded to them through unearned means. Those people are not stupid. They're actually quite clever. They have utilized those unjust means to get there. But we need to make sure that the new cohort of people we are selecting, our leadership emergence process, really need to be pushing for more talented people to get up there. And that will come with diversity, because we know talented people are diverse.
I understand that. But what about you? Because that protectionist approach, which you were just describing, is saying there was two routes and the one route we need to block it. But if that one route, that minority actually has all the power, okay, and they don't want to incorporate inclusivity and bring in, how do we overcome those kinds of barriers, those in clubs and out clubs, those secret discussions which we don't know anything about, but which are taking place and incorporate and enabling people to be elevated above, I'm not going to say above their status, but above their talent?
Yes, of course. I mean, this is, they are going to continue doing that because people like to replicate their own image in positions of power. And also ignorance is the domain of super privileged, because when you are super privileged, you don't have to understand the struggle of others who suffer to get to your position.
Yeah.
But what will happen to them, I can predict the future very well, because we know that diversity is the norm now.
Mhm.
Universities in particular have become super diverse.
Mhm.
It's now called super diversity because if you look at our students today and compare them to 30 years ago,
Mhm.
very different.
Yeah.
So the talent pipeline is no longer dry in terms of diversity. That's why a lot of these elite leadership groups, which come from very traditional backgrounds, are clamoring. There's this talk about war for talent.
Right.
That is the war for white heterosexual men. They are not warring to get diversity through the door, but diversity gets through the door because of the merit and talent. I mean, let them get those super privileged but yet incompetent people through. That will be a marker for their organizational sustainability,
Mhm.
and survival, because the ball game has changed. They can continue to behave in this stupid and retrospective and backward way, but in terms of talent acquisition, competitive recruitment practices, they will be lagging behind. That's why I just ask my friends, let's watch some of them self-harm, because we need to be careful in conserving our energy in our battles, because if we need to show them that this kind of behavior is counter-logical and really unscientific, unsupportable, but I think they will be also their own, they will bring their own end in the end.
Because of that intransigence and the fact that they'll get superseded, they won't be as productive as other organizations.
That's right.
It's interesting that you mentioned about universities, because earlier on in the week there's been a number of, you'll have seen the coverage about student loans and trying to reduce the accessibility of university, and saying it's only a certain type of students who will be allowed to go based on grades, etc. And I just thought to myself, it's almost like switching back the clock, whereby they were saying that only a certain type of person went to university, everybody else goes a different route. So it's not being as inclusive as it could be. So it kind of like touched a nerve when I was hearing what you were saying as well. So
of course they would like to there is definitely a battle between unearned privilege and earned privilege route. So they will of course have these demarcation strategies to limit the access of people with talent, merit, and with a lot of diversity coming through the door. We can't be naive about that, but we also need to respond as strongly as possible. For example, when conservative government came to power, the first thing they wanted to do was to eliminate Equality and Human Rights Commission and attack the equality laws. They couldn't do that, but they undermined a lot of its structures. Now, Equality and Human Rights Commission is even fighting with Stonewall. They have managed to bring their own people, but this is politics. We need to be politically active, not in terms of party politics, but across all parties. We need to find allies and see how we can progress the case of intersectional solidarity to move the talent debate forward. Yeah.
I like the way how you brought that kind of like from the organization, but looking at the political movement within the organization for being a power and a tool for affecting change. Yes. That it's more than, as you've already identified, it's more than just about a change in behavior. It's a change in structure, and to implement that change in structure, we need to have some kind of political, some kind of lobbying, some kind of affirmative actions which will enable us to see the changes that we want to actually see the change happen in real time.
Yeah, we are going through really great time actually in terms of these being prepared for institutional change, because the trust in institutions is all-time low historically in all societies. So we have the lowest level of trust. There's an international trust survey showing this. It's all-time low. So we don't trust education, we don't trust science, we don't trust law, we don't trust police, we don't trust healthcare, we don't trust anything as individuals. And at the same time, social movements are gaining power, and the moral landscape is changing. We need to reform institutions we don't trust with the ones that we can trust. In order to build trust, this is why I keep on using the term trust. Trust as not only an individual thing, but trusting in institutions. We need to create institutions where everybody can trust. And that requires co-design again. And we are actually at a perfect time when social movements are so strong and the moral landscape is so different. We can rebuild our institutions to be more inclusive.
I really like, I like the way how you just articulated that in terms of the need for the development of more trust, because we have a trust deficit at the moment.
Yes.
There's a trust deficit in the organizations which currently exist, but yet there is an ample amount of trust in those social movements because they are being co-created at the same time. So we need to get somewhere, not somewhere in the middle. We need to design something which can propel and lift up those social movements, because it will be more beneficial for everybody.
Definitely. I mean, it also shifts the debate from contributing to organizational performance through diversity. We know that diversity pays generous to organizations, but diversity can also mean exploitation. There's still huge gender pay gap, and we haven't criminalized gender pay gap. It's only Iceland that made it unlawful. We need to make gender pay gap unlawful. We need to make ethnic pay gap unlawful. Sexual orientation pay gap unlawful. We need to, this is how we build trust, because I mean, at the core of everything, it's how much you get paid, how much you are valued, how much is your market value.
Yeah.
We need to start somewhere to push for legislation that shows that in this country, we get the same pay for doing the same work. I mean, this is so fundamental, and we are just playing around the edges. Yeah. In terms of this diversity debate, that is great for organizations. Yes, of course, it's great for organizations to employ me with 15% less. Fantastic for organizations. Yes, I mean, it's like, but we need to move the debate to trust. Let's get the organizations to build trust, because 85% of global leaders in the corporate world now profess their support. They are allies. The overwhelming majority, but they consider allyship as supporting those poor people from diverse backgrounds, atypical backgrounds. Let's support them. Patronizing. Move the debate to what can I do? How can I change my structures so that those atypical people can feel a sense of belonging at work? Yeah. How can my workplace make them feel part of
the organization, part of the fabric?
Yes. How can we get them to improve their longing for example, reaching your full potential? I have a longing for reaching my full potential, but my background here, I have this ceiling above me. I can feel it. I mean, I would love to do fantastic stuff, but institutions need to change for that.
Yeah. This, I could ask you questions for hours, but I have to go over to the audience, so I know I've got a couple of questions. So I've seen two questions. Consolata, would you like to ask yours? And then Rosie, if you would like to ask your question as well.
Sure, thanks, Wayne. Hi, Mustafa, thank you very much for your insights. My question is, how can we ensure that institutions engage social movements effectively? I know you talked a little about all the movements that have happened over the last few years, but if movements have got the trust of the people, but the institutions don't, how can we try and either bring them together more effectively? Thank you.
Actually, this is a very good question, Consolata. We've written a paper on the connection between social movements and individual well-being at work, and how social movements really contribute to individual well-being. Having a community is great for individual well-being, is great for team well-being, is great for also organizations. But I think a lot of the diversity and inclusion debate has neglected the connection of the individual with the greater community and the social movements. But some very progressive organizations I have been following, a lot of the global organizations, some of the very good ones, for example, draw on the power of social networks. How do they do that? They bring representatives of social networks to learn how they can change the design of their organizations. For example, if you have people who are blind, you can go to a blind charity to understand what they need to make changes to accessibility for a group of blind people coming in. Instead of talking to each blind person, you can bring the blind charity in. Similarly, instead of talking to each Black and minority ethnic person in, you can bring representatives of Black Lives Matter, for example, to talk about what their demands are in terms of institutional design and how they can help you recraft an organization which is in line with the new moral landscape. You can do that with women's marches, LGBT networks. Stonewall is going into organizations. So they bring a lot of, social movements bring a lot of energy actually into the D&I space if they are brought in.
Thank you very much. If I could just ask a bit of a follow-up question, how can we avoid such engagements being seen as just lip service? It's all well and good to bring in, representatives from these organizations or movements, but if they're just brought in, okay, we've done this, but then there's no follow-up, that sometimes is not effective.
Very good question, again, Consolata, because I'm a keen believer in collecting evidence, and not only evidence, ex-ante evidence before the event, but also ex-post evidence after the event. We need to collect evidence and through evaluation, we need to evaluate our diversity and inclusion interventions always. We need to show how our diversity and inclusion interventions lead to organizational change. And in order not to make this lip service kind of window dressing initiative, we need to connect these individuals at the higher strategic level, maybe at the board level, to discuss with the board. Whoever is responsible for organizational transformation should be listening, not the one of the really disaster things. But as you asked this question, it came to me, my horror of sitting through diversity and inclusion training in my own organization every year by people who are trained by me, delivering the talk, sheep dipping exercise. Diversity is pushed to just being about training and education of the people who are coming from disenfranchised backgrounds themselves. Let's bring them to more training, more mentoring. Not that kind of drive, but we need to really push the agenda to the strategic level, organizational development. Diversity and inclusion for me is about organizational development. It's not about training and education of people alone.
Fantastic. Consolata, when you asked your question, we had the same follow-up question. It's like we're on the same wavelength. It was kind of like, how do we prevent it from being performative? It has to be active in its agenda. Rosie, do you want to ask your question, please?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Mustafa. Yeah, I'm loving this. But yeah, I heard you talk about intersectional solidarity earlier on, and I'd just like you to, if you can, talk a little bit more about that, because I'm struggling to understand, given it's inherently intersectional and therefore quite diverse. How is that enacted? How do you actually make that happen? That sense of solidarity when you're coming from different viewpoints on unequal footing. So there's no clear lead in that. How would you go about that?
Yeah, this is an excellent question again, Rosie. Thank you so much. I study this notion of intersectional solidarity because with so many social movements emerging, there are also fault lines emerging between these social movements. There are clashes of agendas. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement and LGBT movement, women's marches, there are some tension points. And there are some real issues. For example, feminist movement can have hostilities, intersectional hostilities with trans movement, for example, at some points. So how do we build a communication across these movements so that we can move forward with the tensions? I mean, tensions will always be there because we have separate agendas at the same time. But how do we make sure that we can achieve some progress, forward progress? So I do some sessions on overcoming the discomfort of communication. For example, people shy away from communicating their anxieties around inequality. I also, for example, talk to white men. They are very unhappy about talk of white privilege or male privilege because they feel that their reputation is tarnished by both feminist and Black Lives Matter movements. They feel like they are told that they are incompetent. So how do we keep them in the intersectional solidarity if they are really progressive as allies, for example, in the debate? So this requires building, again, trust, not only among groups, but also seeing who are subscribing to a progressive agenda and who are not. Unfortunately, even in diverse groups, there are people who don't subscribe to progressive agendas. Our very own Priti Patel, for example, we can't put her in boxes of progress, you know, in terms of gender equality, in terms of ethnic equality. I'll be on a boat if she gets survey. So, for example, how do we make sure, because this is an ideology, progress, social progress is an ideology. It doesn't have, it's not only the disenfranchised groups that share it, it's shared by dominant groups, it's sometimes not shared by. Also, people from atypical backgrounds can be very hostile to atypicality itself. I know from the gay movement, which I'm very affiliated with, a lot of gays are very heteronormative. They don't want gays to have ways of performing themselves, which are very different to the family ideology of the heterosexuals. So they are pushing us towards that way. So I think creating platforms which have safe space where people can speak, Rosie, I believe that this will be really important. And then making these rules of engagement very clear. All rights come with responsibilities. For example, often we forget our responsibility to the others, other movements. When we are too involved in one movement, another social movement, we may not realize we have also a responsibility to bring them in because they are also part of our movement. All movements are intersectional, but I think it's, again, a long march. Unfortunately, there is no easy answer.
Yeah.
So essentially, your conversations like we're having right now are part of that then?
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Yeah. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Rosie. Excellent. I think it's very important that we recognize those differences and recognize that although we do have a kind of common goal, that sometimes that common goal can be lost because of these little fractions or these little things which come to play. There is, I know we're virtually out of time, but I just saw one question from Moon Lee. And I wouldn't mind if you could address that question as well. Moon Lee, do you want to ask your question?
Thanks, Wayne. So yeah, thank you for so much for an interesting talk. I myself work in people and organizational development as a coordinator, so I'm learning a lot about organizational development myself. And I just wonder, like, you know, I'm also part of the BAME network as well. And I just wonder, like, you know, you do have like two parties, for example, who are have the best intention to change something. You know, you've got, for example, my network, and then you got like the senior leadership that they really want to change. But sometimes there is a kind of like a gap, a lack of knowledge and expertise, because the senior leadership will come to the network like, how can we improve things? And we're like, I don't know. and it's like, yeah, and just there's so much pressure at the same time, like, you know, coming from us for answers while we're also trying to make sense of surviving, basically. And I wonder how you would address the gap of expertise to make sure there's a solution can be meaningful and efficient for both parties.
Absolutely, Moni. Thank you so much for this really great question. You are very right. This is also typical in global organizations. As I said, overwhelming majority of leaders are allies now. They come to their line management level with their policies saying, let's do something. But then the line management says, what does that mean? Your abstract idea of, you know, inclusion. How do we translate that? So I consider diversity and inclusion as a profession of translation. So you need to go from the bottom up, those demands that people with talent have, with diversity have, with those demands for change to the leadership. And from leadership, those abstract ideas often being translated into process change and organizational development change. Let me find some examples of how this was done. For example, in development of artificial intelligence, if you don't view diversity as a threat, but as a solution, you get a very different picture. For example, artificial intelligence is designed by people like me who are geeks and who have certain interests. Unlike me, they may not be interested in equality. They use the hypertext, which is super sexist, racist. You know, all the text that we have in the world is blemished by the trauma of the past in terms of inequalities. So you have artificial intelligence drawing data from the past text. It will have ingrained forms of bias in it. And sure enough, for example, Facebook shut its artificial intelligence program, which it used for recruitment because it was sexist and racist. No surprise. But if you see diversity and inclusion as a solution, you see that diversity and inclusion at the point of designing artificial intelligence can help you. You overcome it already. So it's bringing people in organizational development, not after the effect, bringing equality and diversity considerations, not after the effect, but at the point of design. Let's design this to make sure that it is more inclusive. It's a fantastic idea. It's a solution. I'll give you one very interesting example from WRVS, Women's Royal Voluntary Service. This is the largest voluntary sector organization. In their hospitals, they provide food and shelter for after police and ambulance service. They are the third group that goes in, and they have 70,000 volunteers. It's a huge operation, but their volunteers are upper class, and they provide the service to whole of Britain. And their Birmingham hospital, their food waste was huge, and diversity officer went to the hospital to check why this food waste was happening. And they discovered that they're offering upper class food in Birmingham hospital. And people were declining to eat it somehow. I don't know why still. So when they went to the patients who were not eating those, even the white patients typically eat curry in Birmingham. It's a common thing to eat there. So when they realized what people want, through a diversity and inclusion initiative, they changed the design of the menu. So you don't see inclusion as a problem, but you see inclusion as the solution to your problems. Identify a problem. This is what I say to organizations that I sometimes go to do consultancy. Let's identify a common problem you have and see whether my knowledge on diversity and inclusion can help you overcome that. Oftentimes it does, because oftentimes there is a huge exclusion issue, discrimination issue behind many of the problems that they are facing in managing people and resources.
Yeah. Mustafa, Moonli, thank you for that question. Very insightful. Thank all of the contributors to the questions. They've all been really good. And Mustafa, your answers have been very, very insightful this afternoon. I'm going to ask just one final question. And this is kind of like on the sense of belonging. Normally, I would ask the question, what advice would you have given to your, say, 16-year-old self about the kind of career that you would have? But I'm going to ask a slightly different question today. I'm going to ask you, what advice would you give to organizations which aren't engaging with changing the inclusion strategies which they currently have?
As I said, I'm into longing for social justice, and social justice demands are not going to become less. The prediction, futurologists argue that social justice demands will increase over the years because the gap between haves and have-nots have been widening internationally, and organizations which want to have a sustainable future really need to listen to these changes. And beyond the instrumental reasons, there are very good moral reasons, because it's the right thing to do. They should be doing inclusion. And I'm very keen on understanding what prevents them from engaging with inclusion debate. And I often get into discussions with organizations which are stuck in their old ways. And I'm very happy to talk to them. And I would just, it's a journey, it's a dialogue. If they open up a dialogue already with me to explore why they are insisting on a certain point, I'm sure we can find ways out of it. They may have some good reasons for keeping their tradition, but I doubt in this day and age. Sometimes the things that worked in the past sometimes taint their future choices. This is merely it, I think.
Fantastic. Mustafa, I want us to say another really big thank you for coming and sharing your insight and wisdom with us this afternoon, because it really has been a lesson in organization, understanding diversity not from a performative action, but from a structural and organizational change, what's necessary for that. So I wanted to say really another real big thank you for agreeing to be our guest this afternoon. And I'm going to just advertise what we've got on for next week, which is Next week, we're going to have Janet Morgan, and she's a teacher, a trainer, a consultant, a life coach. And she's going to come and give us a little bit of her insight into both dyslexia and how working in higher education from her experiences. If you haven't had a chance to see any of the other content or interviews, then please go to our YouTube site, which can be found at tinyurl.com/belonging-IAO, where this one will be uploaded very soon, and you can see content from previous. And all I can say is another really big thank you, and wish you all a very good weekend. See you again next week. Bye-bye.
And thank you, the participants. Wonderful to be here. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.